If you've ever lived in a neighborhood run by an HOA, you'll know there's always one person who takes things way too seriously. Before I tell you how a certain HOA queen tried to ban my garden gnomes, and how that backfired spectacularly, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe because you're about to hear how a few smiling statues brought an entire tyrant to her knees. It started on one of those calm, postcard-perfect mornings. The air smelled of freshly cut grass and wet soil, the kind of morning that makes you forget how exhausting suburbia can be. Birds chattered in the sycamore trees lining Maplewood Drive, and the hum of distant sprinklers filled the air. I stood barefoot in the dew, coffee steaming in my hand, admiring the little army of gnomes that dotted my front lawn. Each one had its own personality, painted over the years by my late wife. Some carried lanterns, others fishing rods. Together they made the house feel alive even after she was gone. But that peace shattered like porcelain the moment I heard the familiar click of high heels on concrete. That sound alone was enough to make the neighborhood dogs go silent. Karen Whitmore, head of the Homeowners Association, emerged from her perfectly trimmed yard like a general inspecting the troops. She was the kind of woman who treated every blade of grass like a soldier, uniform, obedient, and under threat of termination if one dared to stand out. "Good morning, Ethan," she called, already frowning. Her tone suggested it wasn't a greeting but a summons. I forced a smile. "Morning, Karen. Lovely day." Her eyes swept across my gnomes as if she were staring at graffiti. "I see, the gnomes are still here." "Still here," I said. "And still happy." Karen's lips tightened. "Well, they won't be for long. The HOA board received multiple complaints about your clutter." "Clutter?" I blinked. "They're not trash, Karen. They're art." "Art?" She laughed in that sharp, brittle way that made me wish I'd worn noise-canceling earbuds. "Our community values uniformity, Ethan. Not," she gestured toward a gnome with a fishing rod, "whatever this is supposed to be." I didn't say anything. I just stared at her clipboard, always the clipboard. She whipped out a sheet of paper and thrust it into my hands. "An official notice," she declared. "Effective immediately, all unauthorized decorative figures must be removed within 72 hours. I scanned the letter. It looked official, but it wasn't signed by anyone but her. "You do know there's nothing in the bylaws about gnomes, right?" "There will be," she said coldly. "I've already scheduled an emergency meeting to propose the amendment. Retroactively, of course." Retroactively. That word tasted like bile. She strutted away, her perfume thick and suffocating in the air she left behind. I stared down at my little army, painted smiles frozen mid-cheer. My wife used to call them our tiny guardians. Now they stood accused of lowering property values. Over the next few days, Karen's campaign began. Flyers in mailboxes. Snide posts on the neighborhood Facebook page. Some residents have chosen to ignore HOA standards. Please report unsightly decorations. She even attached a picture of my yard, complete with zoomed-in circles around the gnomes like they were crime scene evidence. I tried to ignore it, tried to take the high road. Until the night I heard the sound of breaking ceramic. It was close to midnight. I rushed outside in my slippers, flashlight in hand, and saw the carnage. 2 gnomes were on the ground, their heads shattered. Another lay face down in the dirt, one arm missing. I felt something twist inside me, grief, anger, maybe both. Those gnomes weren't just lawn ornaments. My wife had painted them by hand, back when laughter still filled this house. Seeing them destroyed was like losing her all over again. I knew who did it. Nobody else had a reason. Karen's motion-activated floodlight glowed across the street, illuminating her front door like a throne room. I stood there, fists trembling, imagining her smirk. The next morning I tried diplomacy. I showed up at the HOA meeting, sitting quietly in the back as neighbors discussed recycling bins and street lamp replacements. When my turn came, I stood. "About the gnomes," I began, keeping my voice steady. "I'd like to clarify that they're not in violation of any existing rule." Karen, at the head of the table, cut me off immediately. "Ethan, we've already discussed this." "Actually," I said, holding up a printed copy of the HOA bylaws, "we haven't. There's nothing here that prohibits decorations under 3 feet tall." Her expression didn't even flicker. "Then perhaps we need to amend that, don't we?" A few people chuckled nervously. I looked around for support, found none. Everyone avoided my eyes. Karen's word was law here. She leaned forward. "I'll be kind, Ethan. Remove them yourself, or we'll fine you $100 per gnome." 100. "Per gnome," she repeated, savoring every syllable. The laughter this time wasn't nervous. It was hers. Sharp, cruel, victorious. I sat down slowly. My ears buzzed with heat. My chest felt tight, my throat dry. I didn't say another word for the rest of the meeting. When it ended, Karen passed me with a smug pat on the shoulder. Maybe next time you'll decorate like an adult. By the time I got home, the sunset had turned the sky a bruised red. I walked across the lawn, crunching on bits of broken ceramic I hadn't cleaned up yet. The yard was quiet. Too quiet. The surviving gnomes stood like silent witnesses to my humiliation. I sank into a chair on the porch, rain beginning to fall in soft, rhythmic taps. My coffee had gone cold hours ago, but I didn't move. I just stared at the little faces staring back at me. Their paint was chipped, their smiles fading, but they were still here. Still standing. That's when the thought struck me. A ridiculous, defiant spark at first, but the longer I sat there, the brighter it burned. Karen wanted them gone because they stood out. Because they didn't fit into her polished, predictable world. So what if I didn't just keep them? What if I made more? I turned my gaze toward the garage, where years of tools, paints, and a half-finished 3D printer gathered dust. My wife had always said I could build anything if I put my heart into it. Maybe it was time to prove her right. I rose from my chair, the rain soaking through my shirt, and walked into the garage. The air inside smelled of paint thinner and sawdust. I switched on the light. Its flicker illuminated the shelves of brushes, molds, and half-empty cans of enamel. I touched one of the gnome molds, the edges rough under my fingers, and smiled. "You want to ban my gnomes, Karen?" I said quietly, the words tasting electric on my tongue. "Let's see you handle an army." I set down my coffee, rolled up my sleeves, and pulled the tarp off my workbench. The old 3D printer whirred as it powered up, its screen blinking to life like an awakening sentinel. I could already see it. The rows of gnomes lined up across the lawn, painted, armed with fishing rods, hoses, shovels, and maybe a few surprises. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance. The first raindrops hit the garage roof, drumming like the start of a march. By sunrise, Maplewood Drive would wake to something they'd never seen before. By sunrise, this lawn wouldn't just have gnomes. Would have soldiers. Morning arrived with the crisp, electric charge of something about to go very wrong, or very right. A pinkish dawn stretched over Maplewood Drive, glinting off rows of small, freshly painted figures standing at attention across my lawn. My fingers ached from hours of molding, sanding, and painting through the night, but I didn't feel tired. I felt alive. Every gnome stood proudly on guard, their faces gleaming with new coats of paint, their expressions fixed in silent defiance. There were firefighters with tiny hoses, knights with miniature swords, even a pirate captain aiming a toy musket. But my favorite, the one I'd spent the longest on, stood front and center. A gnome wearing a pastel pink jacket, pearl necklace, and clutching a clipboard twice its size. The resemblance to Karen Whitmore was uncanny. The neighborhood began to stir. Curtains opened, dogs barked, and soon enough, a few early risers came out to grab their morning papers. I watched them from my porch as their eyes widened, then lit up with laughter. Phones came out. Cameras clicked. By the time the fifth neighbor stopped to take a picture, I knew word was spreading. My phone buzzed with notifications. Someone had already posted photos to the community Facebook page with the caption, "Ethan's Gnome Army, Maplewood's greatest comeback." Across the street, Karen's blinds twitched. A shadow moved inside her immaculate home. Then, like clockwork, the front door burst open, and she emerged in her robe, hair already styled like she'd been up for hours rehearsing her outrage. The sight of her alone was almost cinematic. Clipboard in one hand, phone in the other, stomping down her driveway like a general preparing for battle. "Ethan," she called, voice cutting through the calm morning. "What is the meaning of this circus?" I took a slow sip of my coffee. "Morning, Karen. Lovely day. Don't you play coy with me? This mockery violates half a dozen HOA regulations." "Funny," I said, pretending to think. "I didn't see any new rules about gnome quantity limits." Her eyes darted toward the gnome version of herself standing proudly among its brethren. Her face drained of color, then flushed red like a siren. "You think this is funny? You think mocking your HOA president is appropriate?" "Oh, I think it's art," I said. "And you've always said you value art." Neighbors had started gathering by then, some pretending to water their lawns, others openly recording. Laughter trickled through the group. Karen noticed. Her voice grew shrill. "I will not be made a spectacle of, Ethan. This entire display is coming down immediately." She stormed onto my lawn. That was her first mistake. The crowd collectively gasped as her heels sank into a patch of fresh soil, sending her stumbling toward a gnome holding a tiny watering can. She steadied herself, glared at the crowd, and yanked the gnome from the ground. "See? Property damage," she shouted. But as she lifted it, a thin spray of blue paint shot from its can, splattering across her face and pristine robe. The paint was harmless, water-based, but it left a bright sky-blue streak across her cheek like war paint. The crowd erupted in laughter. Karen froze, dripping, eyes wide with disbelief. I had rigged the gnome with a simple pressure nozzle. More prank than trap, but the effect was perfect. Cameras clicked again and someone in the crowd yelled, "Say cheese, Karen." Her lips quivered. "This is harassment," she sputtered. "You'll regret this." "Oh, I doubt it," I said, standing and stepping closer, my tone calm, measured. "Because, you see, I have something to share too." The laughter quieted. Karen blinked. I pulled my phone from my pocket and tapped the screen. The speakers on my porch crackled to life, and her voice poured out, recordings of her own, sharp and venomous. "I'll make him regret ever moving here. Those hideous gnomes make my street look like a carnival. If the board won't help, I'll take matters into my own hands." Her words echoed through the morning air, undeniable. The crowd went dead silent. Her jaw fell open, trembling. Where did you get that?" she whispered. "From my doorbell camera," I said simply. "It recorded everything the night those gnomes were vandalized." Gasps spread through the group. One of the HOA members, a gray-haired man named Doug, stepped forward, glaring at Karen. "You told us the vandalism was a coincidence," he said. Karen stammered, I was trying to maintain order." "By destroying someone's property?" Doug snapped. "You've crossed a line, Karen." I held up a folder, thick with printed screenshots and timestamps. "I also have your text messages, by the way. The ones where you bragged to your friend about teaching me a lesson." The look on her face was pure horror. She reached for her phone, hands shaking, but it was too late. Doug took it from her gently and shook his head. "Effective immediately, you're suspended from all HOA duties until further notice." The crowd murmured in disbelief. Phones were still recording. Karen stood frozen, blue paint dripping down her chin, her once perfect image dissolving in front of an audience she could no longer control. I did it for the community," she croaked weakly. "Funny," I said, meeting her eyes, "because the community doesn't seem to agree." Someone laughed. Then another. Soon the laughter rolled through the crowd like thunder. Even Doug chuckled as he handed me the official HOA seal, shaking his head. "You've got guts, Ethan. And creativity. I think the neighborhood could use more of that." Karen's lip trembled. She tried to speak, but the words never came. She turned and fled, nearly tripping over the gnome version of herself as she ran back toward her house, clutching her clipboard like a lifeline. The door slammed shut behind her, leaving nothing but the echo of her defeat and the hum of morning applause. For a long moment I stood in the middle of my lawn, surrounded by laughter, the smell of fresh paint, and the hum of my printer still running in the garage. The tension that had coiled in me for weeks finally unwound. I hadn't just won. I'd reminded everyone what happens when creativity meets arrogance. By noon the video was everywhere. Clips of Karen's meltdown flooded social media, complete with dramatic music and slow-motion edits. The hashtag #Gnomeageddon trended locally within hours. Someone even made a remix of her shouting, "This is harassment," auto-tuned to a catchy beat. I didn't post any of it myself, but I didn't need to. The internet handled my revenge for me. Within a few days, Karen resigned for personal reasons. Her statement was as cold and bureaucratic as she had always been, full of talk about moving on to new opportunities. The irony was delicious. As for me, my lawn became a local attraction. Families stopped by to take pictures. Kids giggled at the night gnomes and pirate captains. I even caught a glimpse of a news crew once, filming a short feature on the Great Gnome Army of Maplewood. That evening, when the crowd finally dispersed, I stood on my porch again. The sun dipped low, spilling gold across the hundreds of painted faces smiling back at me. I knelt beside the Karen gnome, the blue paint still streaked faintly on its cheek, and adjusted its tiny clipboard. Then I added a new one beside it, freshly finished. This one held a sign that read, "Creativity, 1, Control, 0. I chuckled, setting down my brush. "You did good," I murmured to the gnome army. The breeze rustled the leaves overhead, and for a brief second, it felt like my wife was there, watching, amused, proud. I could almost hear her voice whisper, "You finally used your stubbornness for something good." I smiled, breathing in the smell of rain-soaked earth and acrylic paint. The neighborhood had never felt this alive. The laughter, the color, the sense of victory, It was everything this street had been missing. I took one last sip of my coffee, now lukewarm, and looked across the yard at the tiny painted faces still standing guard. Turns out, I said softly, the HOA doesn't stand a chance against a united front. And as the sun slipped beneath the horizon, the gnome army stood gleaming in the fading light, silent but victorious, each one grinning like it knew exactly what we'd done.